So welcome back. I think this is part 4 or 5. I think it's part 5 of our unit or subunit on Greek art. We had left off talking about the Acropolis, which was the sort of urban development started by Pericles, who was a famous Greek general, and he wanted to promote public works of art and architecture. And the Parthenon is probably one of the most famous structures located on the Acropolis. What you're looking at now is a floor plan of the temple. And again, you have to be able to recognize the floor plan. Often they'll show you the floor plan and expect you to know what building or structure they're referring to. So hopefully you've gotten a better handle on that. The circles represent columns, the thicker walls, or these heavy lines represent heavy walls. So you can tell that this is a perpetual style temple with a colonnade going all the way around. This particular diagram gives you some information in terms of the decorative program. It talks about the frieze and some of the metatopes. That's how you say it. These are exterior parts of the frieze that we had talked about, and it's important because these served to hold sculpture and relief carvings, and this was considered the decorative program of the temple. So the Parthenon was designed by the architects Ictinus and Callicrates. Phidias was in charge of the sculptural decoration, so he supervised the actual decorative program. It was completed in 432 BCE as a temple to Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. The Parthenon celebrates her in her aspect as a virgin goddess, Parthenos, Greek for virgin, and the root of the word parthenogenesis, which means virgin birth, was one of Athena's attributes. Athena was also the goddess of wisdom and war. Recording. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't think it was recording. Okay. Let me get back. So here, oh, I don't want to start it over. Here is what remains of the structure today. The Parthenon stands, and it's a Doric temple. You can tell by the columns. They have that sort of pancake capital shape, and it's obviously a later version of a Doric temple. We looked at some earlier ones during the Archaic period. We're looking at, this is an example of a classical or a classic temple from this period. And really, in terms of temples, there's no previous or earlier Greek temples that express classical balance, proportion, and unity to the same extent as the Parthenon. Its exceptional aesthetic impact is enhanced by its so-called refinements, which are slight architectural adjustments to improve the visual impression of the building. For example, lines that are perceived as horizontals actually curve upward and in the middle. The original rationale for this is not known for certain, but it corrects the tendency of human eye or our human vision to perceive a long horizontal as curving downward in the middle. So they were probably thinking of this as an illusion to sort of correct that. Other refinements involve the columns. All columns are tilted inward slightly and are placed closer together towards the corners of the building. This creates a sense of stability and accentuates the corners, resulting in an almost imperceptible frame on either side of the on each of the four sides. So, again, this really goes to this idea of attention to detail and really how how these artists really thought about this and really wanted to instill this idea of perfection and balance into sculpture and architecture. So this is a recreation. This is a recreation of the cult statue that would have been located in the Parthenon. It's the Athena Parthenos. It would have been located in the cella of the Parthenon. The purpose of temples in antiquity was generally to house the statue of the patron god or goddess. The Parthenon naos contained the great statue of Athena herself. In this reconstruction model, she is armed and represented in her aspects as the goddess of war. She stands and confronts her viewers directly, wearing Medusa's head on her breastplate and holding a Nike. And a Nike, this is over here, is a winged figure, very similar to an angel, in her right hand and a shield in her left. Both shield and pedestal were decorated with reliefs by Phidias. This colossal statue, and colossal means over life size, is an exception to the human scale of classical art. Usually with classical statues, they were done to, to be, correct in terms of proportion and balance. So like the scale, like usually the sculptures of human figures that we've been looking at are the same size as a normal human figure. But this idea of a colossal statue embodied Athena's importance as the patron goddess of Athens, her central position in the pediment, which we'll look at, and the offerings of the peplos in the frieze, which we'll look at in detail later, reflect her wisdom and power, as well as the Athenians' devotion to her. So this must have been quite impressive to enter the temple and see this beautiful cult statue in gold. So we're going to be looking at some of the decorative program. We're going to be looking at some of the pediment sculptures on both sides of the temple. So the building itself was decorated with marble sculptures representing scenes from Athenian cult and mythology. There are three categories of architectural sculpture. The frieze, carved in low relief, ran up around all four sides of the building inside the colonnade. Let me go back just to kind of point that out. So this is the frieze, or this is the frieze. So it would have run all along here. The metopes, carved in high relief, were placed at the same level as the frieze above the architrave, surmounting the columns on the outside of the temple. The pediment sculpture, carved in the round, fill the triangle gables at each end. So let me go back. So here are those metopes here, and then the pediment, this is what's left of the pediment right here. Although the building was to undergo a number of changes, it remained largely intact until the 17th century. The early Christians turned the temple into a church, adding an apse at the east end. It was probably at this time that the sculptures representing the birth of Athena were removed from the center of the east pediment, and many of the metopes were defaced. The Parthenon served as a church until Athens was conquered by the Ottoman Turks in the 15th century, when it became a mosque. In 1687, during the Venetian siege of the Acropolis, the defending Turks were using the Parthenon as a store for gunpowder, which was ignited by the Venetians' bombardment. The explosion blew out the heart of the building, destroying the roof and parts of the wall and the colonnade. The Venetians succeeded in capturing the Acropolis, but it held it for less than a year. Further damage was done in an attempt to remove sculptures from the west pediment when the lifting tackle broke and the sculptures fell and were smashed. Many of the sculptures that were destroyed in 1687 are now known only from drawings made in 1674 by an artist probably identified as Jacques Carré. The Parthenon sculptures were located in four sections of the building and integrated harmoniously with the architecture. So remember this idea of measure, balance, and proportion, and this sort of harmonious like perfection, and this idea of beauty or beauty being this idea of sort of mathematical perfection and proportion. Their narratives' content proclaim the greatness of classical Athens. And as you can see here, like some of the earlier Doric temples we looked at, these sculptures, they have different body positions to sort of fit. They're all the same size in terms of, a life-size figure, but to fit in that sort of triangular space, they're at different body stances. So upright, sitting, laying down, so forth. So, and I'm sorry, you can't see the date. It's on there. So this is a mock-up of the east pediment of the Parthenon using photographs of the marble sculptures that were removed. Figures, again, are lifelike and express movement. Even without heads and hands, figures seem quite expressive. Composition of figures within the pediment complex again, sort of reflect these different positions of being upright, sitting, laying down to fit within that awkward triangular space. You do see real interaction in how figures react to one another. So again, these don't seem rigid and stiff like the archaic figures from before. And even the Christios boy, but we actually see people sort of pointing and gesturing and looking, and it really does seem like live human beings interacting with each other. These figures represent the respect and love Greeks had for the human body. Figures would have been painted with bright colors. So again, it's sometimes hard for us to imagine, but these would have been painted and rather in bright, kind of garish colors. So this is a detail of Helios and his horses, and sometimes it's also and Dionysus or Hercules. They're not exactly sure, and this is from the east pediment of the Parthenon. Helios and his horses and Dionysus or Hercules from the east pediment of the Parthenon depicts Hercules or Dionysus lying on a panther skin, reclining, relaxed, this reclining position, sort of being relaxed, possibly allows him to sort of fit nicely in the corner space of the pediment wall. So the reason why they think it's either Dionysus, because he's the god of wine, and it looks like he could be holding, sorry. It looks like he could be holding like a glass of wine, and he's also reclined, which is how they would eat and dine often. But also it could be Hercules, again, because he's on this panther skin, or what they might think is a panther skin, which is an attribute of Hercules. So sometimes it's hard to tell exactly the identity of who's being represented. And Helios is, he's really not, this is what's left of Helios and his horses. This is, and I'm sorry, let me see if I can, this is the three goddesses. This is from the east pediment, Hestia, Dione, and Aphrodite, perhaps. Again, it's hard to make attributions. Three goddesses on the east pediment of the Parthenon show the birth of the goddess Athena from the head of her father, Zeus. The sculptures that represent the actual scene are lost. Zeus was probably shown seated while Athena was striding away from him, fully grown and armed. Only some of the figures range on either side of the lost central group survive. They include these three goddesses who were seated to the right of the center from left to right. Their postures vary in order to accommodate the slope of the pediment that originally framed them. So again, this attention of sitting and then sort of reclining to kind of fit that that triangular shape of the pediment. They are remarkable for their naturalistic rendering of anatomy, blended with a harmonious representation of complex draperies. And so this is something that the Greeks become really well known for, is this, and sometimes you'll hear the term wet drapery. So it almost seems like this drapery clings to their body, and it really shows the volume, and it really does look like there's a body underneath all this drapery. So this is a really unique characteristic of the high classical period in Greece. All right, so the figure on the left is on point of rising and tucks her right foot into to sort of level herself. You can kind of see right here. So again, this sort of natural way of sitting and standing, these are sort of natural postures, and they're very lifelike. To the right, another figure cradles a companion reclining luxuriously in her lap. They are perhaps from left to right Hestia, goddess of the hearth and home, and Dione and her daughter Aphrodite. However, another suggestion is that the two figures on the right are the personification of the sea, Thalassa, in the lap of the earth god of the earth, Gaia. So, and again, what's really interesting and really kind of shows you how observant these classical Greek artists were, is that they're posed so that they do really fit together logically into this triangular space. I know I keep repeating that. But their repeated diagonal planes relate to the two diagonals of the pediment. And then the graceful curves of their garment are very harmonious with some of the other architectural curves of the Doric order of the column. So all of this was, meant to kind of go together and flow together. It's not just random, like we're just going to put these sculptures up in this pediment and hope for the best. I mean, they really looked at the whole temple, the architecture, the features, the decorative program, and how they all related to each other. And again, even though they don't have their heads, you really do get a sense of the personality of the figures because they are so naturalistic and lifelike. All right. And this is just to show you a comparison of this idea of wet drapery, which we see here. And this is a Greek sort of chorus figure called Hera of Samos. And here you can see how, in these chorus figures, these archaic figures, the drapery is very stylized. And here it almost looks like a column. And then here we see how the drapery in just a very short time has really changed and looks realistic, and again is very, just very dramatic, and again, it's really suggestive. Like, it's more suggestive than perhaps the nude female form, because you can really get a sense of the body underneath. All right, now we're going to move to the frieze of the Parthenon. So details of the Pantheonic festival procession frieze from the Parthenon is what we're going to look at. Again, the frieze went around the whole, diameter of the building, and what you're looking at are different sections of it. The Athenian sculptor Phidias was appointed to oversee its construction and decoration on the Parthenon. The project employed a huge number of artists from Athens and elsewhere from 447 to 432 BCE. The frieze depicts some 360 figures taking part in the festival known as the Great Pantheonic Procession. The scenes include racehorses, a cortege of offering bearers. We see servants leading sacrificial animals and so on. At the close of the festival, celebrated every 4 years in honor of the goddess Athena, young women belonging to the Athenian aristocracy known as the Agrastans. And this is, I think, down here. This is the one that you really need to be responsible for. Presented the goddess with a specially woven and embroidered peplos. That should be familiar. It's a type of garment that Greek women wore. And an overgarment worn over the shoulders. So that's what the peplos is. So they actually decorate it. They would give, clothe the cult statue. The decorative programs of the frieze is highly unusual within its composition. In the past, only gods and heroes have been represented. This signals a shift in how Greeks viewed themselves and their superiority and self-worth. So the fact that they're actually depicting themselves on this monument is very telling about this idea of humanism and how they thought about themselves in the world. And so, again, that's a big deal, and that's what you really need to remember about the content and the context of this frieze. The upper part of the frieze is cut in higher relief than the lower part, since the lower part would be more visible from the ground level. The frieze as a whole communicates the precession, acceleration, and deceleration during various moments depicted. So there are parts when you go around, like here, the horses look like they're kind of in a frenzy, and then there are other parts of the frieze where it seems more calm. And so you get that sense of that movement of how this festival must have felt, this sort of procession and the acceleration of the horses moving, and then maybe like the quieting part when they approached the temple and presented the goddess with her peplos. So here's the plaque of Ergastines. And this is a fragment from the frieze, and you are responsible for this. This is one of the major 250 works that you need to know on the major AP exam. The high point of the great pantheonic procession, the ceremony in which the sacred peplos was presented to Athena, is depicted on the eastern side of the Parthenon, in the center of the building's main facade, beneath the gaze of assembled Olympian gods. The Louvre plaque is part of this, and this is located in the museum. The Louvre is part of this climatic scene. It portrays the solemn procession of and I know I'm saying it wrong, Ergastines as they approach the statue of Athena, welcomed by two priests. One of the younger women carries a cup without a base, and this was a type of cup used for libations or alcohol, and for pouring ceremonial drinks. The last Ergastine, who appears to be turning around, shares the burden of a heavy incense burner with a young girl who is depicted on the adjoining plaque in the British Museum in London. Originally, the background of the frieze was painted blue, while the figures' hair and parts of their clothing were highlighted in gold. Again, I know it's hard to imagine, but these were painted. And I think about it, and it really just it seems like the details and the sort of sophistication of the carving would get lost. But anyway, so these were brightly painted and highlighted with gold leaf. Additional accoutrements, objects, and clothing accessories were modeled separately in metal and applied to the finished frieze, and these have now been lost. So they actually would have had like little accoutrements and objects such as the peplos core that we looked at. Whatever object she held, showed her identity, and so they did something similar with the frieze and the figures in the frieze. The decoration of the Parthenon was a high point in Greek art of the classical period. This plaque shows a perfect mastery of relief carving techniques. The sculptor has enlivened the scene by placing the participants in pairs and by contrasting the upright stance and the straight arms of the processional figures with more expressive gestures of the priests facing them. So you can kind of see here the two male priests. And so you can kind of see how he's a little bit more animated. The priests and their postures are a little bit more rigid and upright. And so there's that nice sort of juxtaposition and tension between the figures. The figure of the Ergostines are angled to provide a series of alternating frontal, side, and three-quarter views that lead the spectator's gaze along a slowly progressing line. The grave expressions and uniform yet graceful poses of the Ergostines convey the solemnness of the ceremony. All right, well, I'm going to stop here. We'll be picking up, looking at some later temple architecture. We'll also be looking at the Hellenistic period, which is the late period in Greek art, which I think is almost better and just as beautiful as the classical, the golden period in Greek art that we just looked at. So stay tuned.